thought my life had settled into a quiet routine. At 65, I believed the most thrilling moments were behind me, comfortable, uneventful years shared with my husband in our modest home. Retirement brought its own rhythm, lazy mornings, evening walks, and the steady hum of life passing without much fuss. We were simply waiting out the years together, content in our predictability. But sometimes life turns on its head when you least expect it. It started with a simple knock on the door, a gesture so ordinary it shouldn't have stood out. Yet there I was, a cake in hand, smiling politely as I welcomed our new neighbors. A couple in their 40s, friendly and warm, exchanging pleasantries as they introduced their 18-year-old twin sons, Kell and Ron. The boys were tall, full of youthful energy, and carried themselves with an easy confidence. When I mentioned my age, the twins exchanged a glance and laughed, teasing that I didn't look a day over 50. I laughed along, brushing off the compliment with practiced ease. We chatted for a while, their parents thanking me for the cake, the boys grinning in a way that made the conversation light and effortless. Throughout the day, there were more small encounters. They stopped by to ask where the nearest store was, where they could find a pharmacy, and whether they could leave their dog with us now and then. Simple requests, neighborly and polite. They carried a natural charm, the kind that made conversations easy. When they laughed, it was carefree and unburdened. Each interaction was brief, marked by casual words and easy smiles. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The soft lines etched by time, the silver strand streaking through my hair. I adjusted my collar with a quiet nod, the scent of home-cooked food filling the room, the steady rhythm of my familiar life continuing on. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden shadows across the yard, I considered how quickly a home could shift with new faces next door. It started as something innocent. Days folding into each other like soft linen, the quiet pattern of retirement unchanged, save for the sound of footsteps across the yard. Light, eager steps familiar now. The twins visited often, always with a reason. A bouquet of wildflowers cradled in young arms, glistening with morning dew. An offer to carry groceries or a casual stop to share stories under the sun. Their presence became a fixture, warm and familiar. My husband praised them, laughing that young men like them were rare these days. Wonderful boys, he said. I agreed, believing it. But somewhere between their visits, something subtle shifted. They came more often, twice a day than 3. No reason, no errands. They lingered, always close. Their laughter easy, but their gazes sharper. They moved around the house with casual familiarity, brushing against chairs, leaning too comfortably on door frames. Sometimes when they brought flowers, lilies, peonies, freshly cut and fragrant, I caught them watching me longer than necessary. Their eyes, dark with something unspoken. At first it made sense. They must have missed their grandmother, I told myself. I laughed when my husband teased, they'll be flirting with you soon. Absurd. A grandmother figure at 65 with silver streaks in her hair and a body softened by time. There was no room for such thoughts. I dismissed it easily yet. There were moments, small ones, that unsettled me. When they passed behind me in the kitchen, standing just a breath too close. The brush of a hand against mine when passing a plate. The warmth of their skin, so close it seemed to hum in the air between us. I told myself it was my imagination, that I had simply forgotten what youth looked like up close. But then everything shifted. It was a quiet afternoon. The air in the house was still heavy with the scent of flowers they had brought earlier. My husband had stepped out. The house seemed too quiet when the knock came, and I opened the door to find them there again. Smiling as always. But something about their smile seemed different this time, lingering, slow. They stepped inside without hesitation. Conversation was light, casual. I turned toward the window, adjusting the sheer curtain when I felt it. A hand firm, warm, resting on my waist. Not accidental. His fingers curved with deliberate ease as if they belonged there. You are so beautiful. I cannot not be here. The words came low, close to my ear. I froze. The air seemed to thin. Before I could gather a response, the other's voice followed. Oh yes, you're the most beautiful woman we've ever met. I laughed, too quickly, too nervous. My voice felt unfamiliar in my throat. A brittle sound that didn't fit the softness of the room. I stepped away, smoothing my dress as though that would brush away the strange heaviness in the air. It's time for you boys to go home now, I murmured, forcing a smile. I need to rest. They left, slow steps retreating, glances over their shoulders. Silence returned, but it wasn't comforting anymore. I sat by the window, staring at the empty yard where their shadows had stretched just moments before. My hand brushed my waist, the spot where his fingers had rested. I could still feel the faint impression, as if the warmth of his touch had seeped through the fabric. What did they mean? It seemed harmless until the words returned, unbidden, echoing louder now in the quiet. You know, our fantasy is twins and a woman your age. Grandma, as you like to say. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. My own words, Grandma, mocked me now. I pressed my fingers to my lips. Shocked wasn't enough. Months of small gestures, lingering gazes, soft compliments, what I thought was kindness, rearranged themselves in my mind, revealing something I hadn't dared consider. They had been waiting, warming me up day by day. I sat still, listening to the quiet hum of the house, wondering when exactly the air between us had changed. I had always believed in the quiet dignity of a faithful life, decades beside a man who knew me, whose steady presence shaped the years into a predictable rhythm. There had been no questions, no temptations. We shared comfort, history, and the slow drift of time. But something unspoken and impossible, had begun to crack through that certainty. For months they had been there. The constant visits, the flowers wilting in vases they brought, footsteps echoing in the hall when they stayed longer than they should have. The way their gazes lingered, brushing against the edges of propriety, yet never quite crossing the line. Until now, I could no longer pretend it was innocent. I gave in. Shame burns even as I think it. The choice wasn't clear, it wasn't a decision at all. It was a slow unraveling thread by thread, until there was nothing left to hold together. It was a late afternoon, the air still and thick, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin. My husband had stepped out, and I had returned to my room, hoping that distance would settle my mind. But there was a knock, a soft one. I should not have opened the door. And yet I did. He stepped inside without hesitation. His breath calm, gaze steady. The door clicked shut, and the air seemed to hold itself in place. Then I felt it. The slow, deliberate warmth of his breath close to my ear. Lips soft and sure grazing the side of my neck. A pause long enough for me to step back to stop this, yet I didn't. My hand lifted, brushing him away, but lightly, far too lightly. Not enough to stop him. The space between us disappeared again. His lips returned, slower this time, as though testing the boundary I had pretended to hold. And something inside me faded to black. The years that had settled into my skin seemed to dissolve. Their hands were warm, firm, taking mine with a confidence that shouldn't have belonged to boys. They guided me, unhurried, as if this had always been inevitable. I stood because they willed it. The air was thick with a quiet that drowned out reason. Their closeness was overwhelming. One mouth found the hollow of my neck, the softest of touches drawing heat along the skin there. The other, with a slow insistence, brushed fingers along my collarbone, exploring the space where fabric met flesh. A hand lifted to my chin, gentle, almost reverent, turning my face until I could see only him. His lips met mine, firm but questioning, waiting for resistance that never came. The warmth of that moment was dizzying. I felt the years peel away with every slow breath shared between us. The other stayed behind, his breath stirring the fine hair along my neck. Hands that should have felt unfamiliar instead knew exactly where to settle. Each touch seemed designed to remind me of something I had long stopped believing I would feel again. And yet, the haze lifted. Suddenly, clarity came with a sharp rush of cold. I stepped back, breath shallow, my fingers trembling where they touched my own lips, as if wiping away a dream I couldn't admit had been real. "Not now," I whispered, too soft. I should have spoken louder, firmer. "It's time for you to go home. Please." But I didn't say stop. I didn't say never. Instead, what fell from my lips was worse. "Not now. Not no." 2 words that shouldn't have been spoken. Promise I didn't mean to give. A door I should have closed forever but left slightly ajar. They stepped back, smiles slow and knowing, as if they had heard something entirely different. And when the door closed behind them, I stood there, alone in the gathering dusk, with the weight of those 2 words hanging in the air. Not now. The taste of regret was bitter. But beneath it, buried and unwelcome, was something else. A pulse of something I could not name. The night stretched endlessly. The house was cloaked in shadows, quiet save for the faint hum of distant traffic. I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, staring at nothing, hands resting still in my lap. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with a memory that refused to settle. The taste of those moments lingered, faint as perfume after someone has left the room. The warmth of breath on my neck, the deliberate brush of fingers along my skin. My lips still felt unfamiliar, touched by something I had convinced myself was long forgotten. I replayed it again and again. The way their bodies moved so close, the confidence of youth pressing against the fragile boundary I had thought unbreakable. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one struggling against the memory of soft lips grazing the hollow of my throat. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I pressed my palms against the wooden frame of the window, cool glass meeting my forehead. Outside, the world slept beneath a blanket of stars. But here inside this room, the night breathed differently. The air touched my bare skin where my robe had loosened at the collar, sending quiet shivers along places I hadn't felt alive in years. And that phrase, "not now," echoed back with a quiet cruelty. Sleep refused to come. The sheets felt too warm, too confining. I shifted beneath them, restless. My mind was far from this room. It was caught in the lingering sensation of hands, steady and young, guiding, exploring. When had I last been touched like that? The question slipped into my thoughts uninvited. The years had passed in quiet companionship with my husband, comfort without urgency. The longing for something more had faded so slowly. I hadn't noticed when it disappeared altogether. But now, the next morning dawned pale and cold. I moved through the house as if sleepwalking. The same routines. Coffee brewed in its familiar rhythm. Dishes clinked softly in the sink. But everything felt different. The walls seemed to lean in closer, the air still holding a faint trace of what had nearly happened. I tried to shake it, to forget the weight of their gazes. Yet the memory remained, as persistent as a pulse beneath the skin. The doorbell rang. My breath caught before I could stop it. I shouldn't have moved. I should have stayed rooted in the safety of the kitchen, let the sound fade into silence. But my feet carried me forward, slow and inevitable. The door creaked open. There they were, standing there with the sun behind them, golden light catching the edges of their features. Smiling, calm, as if they knew something I didn't. No words. The silence between us said more than speech could manage. They stepped forward, not hurried, not questioning. And I stepped back. Not enough. The door closed behind them with a softness that felt final. The air shifted again. A hand brushed against mine, light, tentative, testing. I should have spoken. Should have said no, should have stopped what I knew was coming. But I didn't. The distance between us narrowed. I stood still. The warmth of breath grazed my neck once more. The same deliberate slowness. Their movements without hesitation, as if this moment had always belonged to them. Fingers warm and sure, traced the line of my wrist, pausing where the pulse beat fast and shallow. Another hand brushed against my collarbone, where skin warmed too easily under such attentions. A mouth close again, finding the spot just below my ear, breath stirring the fine hairs there. The world outside this room fell silent. But inside here, everything seemed to pulse with the weight of a decision I was no longer making. The room seemed to shift without my noticing. What began as a quiet moment by the door unfolded slowly, leading us down the hallway with footsteps soft against the carpet. The air had changed, thicker, warmer, as if the house itself held its breath. The door to the bedroom stood open, letting in the pale afternoon light that spilled across the sheets. I did not think of him, of the man who had shared these rooms with me for so many years. His absence felt distant, unimportant. The clock ticked somewhere in the background, but time no longer moved in a straight line. They were close again, closer than before. Fingers traced the fabric along my shoulders, slow, deliberate, testing. The quiet sound of fabric sliding against skin seemed louder than anything. Another hand followed, brushing down my side, pausing where curves had softened with years. For a moment I looked down. The reflection in the mirror across the room showed me everything I had tried not to think about. Skin marked by time, softness where there was once firmness. The kind of body that belonged to someone who believed those years were behind her. Yet there they were, young, vibrant, standing before me without hesitation. Why? The question echoed faintly but never reached my lips. The touch was slow, as if they understood something I did not. I gave in. The bed felt unfamiliar beneath me. Sheets cool against warm skin. Fingers brushed lightly along the inside of my wrist, pausing where the pulse beat too fast. A slow glide downward, as if they had all the time in the world. Breath hitched in the stillness. Could I still feel it? The question came unbidden, drifting through the haze of the moment. But then a hand pressed lower and the answer came without words. The fabric that had once been a barrier clung damply, giving away secrets I had long forgotten I could tell. Another presence beside me, a warmth along my side. A hand at my neck, gentle but certain. Not rushed, not uncertain. The weight of years seemed to lift with every breath shared between us. My eyes closed. And with that the room faded. I imagined something else entirely. A place far from here. An island with endless skies and no questions. No names, no obligations, only the raw hum of being wanted. Not for who I had been, not for what I represented, but simply as I was. No guilt followed me there. Only the rhythmic rise and fall of breath. The warmth of skin against skin. The world outside that room could not reach me. Here there was only now. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken, something inevitable. The soft rustle of fabric echoed louder than it should have, each sound carrying weight. The dim light painted slow-moving shadows across the walls, stretching and shifting with every movement. There was no rush, only the steady unfolding of something that had been hovering in the spaces between glances and gestures for far too long. Ron's hands moved with care, slow and deliberate, brushing lightly where fabric still lay, a quiet exploration as though memorizing the texture of skin long untouched. The cotton was plain, unremarkable. It held years of familiarity, comfort, and the quiet truth of time passing. And yet the way his fingers slipped beneath it made it seem like something else entirely. There was no hesitation as it was drawn away, just the steady rhythm of breath shared in the narrowing space between two bodies. Ron came closer, the warmth of his skin meeting mine, slow and encompassing. The weight of him wasn't oppressive, it was grounding, reminding me that I was still here, still able to feel. Every point where our bodies touched seemed to pulse with quiet energy, a hum beneath the surface that neither of us acknowledged aloud. A breath, drawn deeper than before, close to my ear, carrying words whispered low, "This is exactly what I've been dreaming of." The words hung there, suspended between the two of us, impossible to ignore. A quiet confession wrapped in warmth and closeness, stirring something deep within. The rhythm of breath shifted. Slower. Shallower. The curve of his back beneath my fingertips was warm and steady. My hands moved without thought, tracing lines long forgotten, rediscovering the feel of skin warming under touch. My legs shifted, rising with an instinct that required no permission. The softness of the sheets tangled beneath us, the air thick with warmth and something deeper. Eyes closed, everything else faded. The room, the years, the doubts slipping away, leaving only sensation. The quiet rhythm grew steadier, unhurried but certain. Time seemed to pause between breaths, between each slow movement that deepened the connection without words. His breath hitched, a quiet sound, barely there, but enough to send a shiver along my spine. A reminder that this was real, that the space between memory and the present moment had finally closed. Slow. Measured. The air felt electric, every movement drawing out something deeper, something long buried beneath years of routine and quiet acceptance. There was no need to speak. The silence said enough, carrying every unspoken thought, every flicker of uncertainty swallowed by the slow certainty of the moment. And so I let go. For now there was no need for understanding, no space for questions. Only the rise and fall of breath, the warmth of skin against skin, and the slow realization that some parts of us remain waiting, quiet and patient, until they are reminded how to feel. Next came Kell's hands. He sat next to me, watching. I could feel it, even though my eyes were closed. He gave us time. Now it was his turn. He changed the rules. He lifted me off the bed, placing my back to him. The room was dim, shadows dancing on the walls, soft and intimate. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. His hands were firm on my waist, lifting me gently, the heat of his body pressing against mine. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of him spread through me, a quiet pulse that seemed to match the quickening of my heart. There was something about the way he touched me, with a tenderness that contrasted the urgency building between us. It felt like every touch, every movement, was drawn out, deliberate, as though we were savoring the moment, tasting it in silence. I leaned back, feeling his breath warm against the curve of my neck. His lips were soft, but there was a longing in them that made my skin tingle. The closeness of his body, the weight of it, was overwhelming in the best way. It was as though the world outside of this moment didn't exist anymore. My thoughts were lost in the sensation, caught in a swirl of warmth and anticipation. He shifted, his hands tracing the line of my back, sending little sparks of sensation wherever his fingers touched. My breath caught, the pressure inside me mounting slowly, deliciously, as his hands moved lower. I felt the ground beneath me shift, his strength guiding me, tilting me, and suddenly the world felt smaller, more focused just on us. The space between us disappeared, as he finally entered, and all that was left was a rhythm, unspoken, instinctive. The air between us was charged, crackling with unvoiced need. I couldn't help but follow the pull of it, the way his presence seemed to fill every empty space. I wanted to lose myself in it, in him, to be swept away by the current of feeling that surged through my veins. But even in the quiet of it all, the pressure was there, rising within me, something unmistakable and alive. I could hear the sound of our breaths mingling, the soft sighs that came unbidden, and the deep rhythm of his movements against me. It was a dance, slow and deliberate, but with an undercurrent of something urgent, something that demanded release. And I let it come, the sensation washing over me, a rush that left me breathless, my heart beating too fast, too loud in the stillness. It was the silence after that was almost more telling. The way we simply existed together, bodies still close, breaths intertwined, the quiet hum of contentment in the aftermath. It started slowly, as though my body didn't remember how to react, yet instinctively it knew. The tremors ran down my spine like a forgotten melody, each note sending shivers to places I thought had long fallen silent. The air felt thicker somehow, like it was filled with something I had been missing for years. My skin tightened, alive with sensations that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. I could hear the faint rustling, but it felt so far away, as if the world had turned down its volume to make space for the strange rhythm of my heart. My hands were cold, but not in the way they used to be. It was more like a calm before a storm, an awareness that something was about to shift. The rush inside me built, unexpected, almost unfamiliar, drawing me deeper into this moment. I stood there still, watching as everything around me moved, but I remained suspended in time, uncertain of what was happening but too intrigued to stop it. A soft breeze from the open window brushed over my skin, heightening everything, the heat of my body, the quickened pulse of my heart, the yearning that had been buried for so long. I felt it then, the pressure, subtle but undeniable, as though my body was rediscovering something it had abandoned. It was a quiet storm, a delicate force that surged beneath my chest, a mixture of uncertainty and something much more powerful. I knew this feeling, this surge, but it had been absent for years, tucked away like a secret I could never speak aloud. As my legs trembled, I became aware of the distance between me and everything else. My thoughts scattered in the face of something so raw and immediate, every pulse of my body screaming louder than anything I could comprehend. There was a sweetness in the air, a depth in the silence, and it was as though my very soul was yearning to let go. But fear clung to me, fear of what had been lost, of what I couldn't take back. I was caught between two realities. One, the quiet anticipation of the present, and the other, a nagging reminder of everything I had to lose. The weight of what I had just done settled over me like a heavy veil. As my fingers touched the fabric of the clothes they handed me, I could feel my chest tightening, my breath coming quicker. The rush of shame, sharp and swift, washed over me, and I found myself dressing hurriedly, trying to escape the pull of something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. I didn't know what had led me here. Whether it was desperation or the simple need to feel something real. I didn't know what had changed in me, but it had. In a single moment, I had stepped into a space where I was no longer certain of who I was, what I wanted, or who I should be. All I knew was that I had crossed the line I couldn't uncross, and it was terrifying. The fear crept in again. Fear of what my husband would think, what he would say if he ever knew. And I couldn't see an escape. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stop thinking about the consequences. But in the quiet aftermath, the rush of blood still thrumming through my veins, I knew one thing. I had been alive in a way I hadn't been for far too long. And even if I didn't understand it, I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. It wasn't just the act, but the discovery. The spark that flickered again after years of dormancy. I was afraid of losing everything, of exposing myself. But there was another fear, one more insidious. The fear of never feeling this way again. I stood there for a moment, the words hanging in the air, their weight heavier than any gesture they had made. "Thank you for fulfilling our fantasy," Ron had said, his tone flat, almost clinical, as though he was acknowledging an accomplishment. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't the fantasy they had in mind. It was something much more personal, something I had never anticipated. I was no longer a person in that moment. I had become a goal they could check off, a fleeting desire they could now dismiss. And with that, something inside me curled up in a tight ball. They had been kind in their words, but I knew the truth. I was their achievement and nothing more. And that was the bitter pill I had to swallow. It made me feel smaller, more insignificant than I had ever felt before, as though I had been nothing more than a shadow in their game. My stomach churned, twisting in a way I couldn't shake. The very thing that had felt like a forgotten part of me, something reawakened by their touch, now felt wrong. It wasn't the act. It wasn't even the people. It was the realization that I had been used in a way I hadn't prepared for. Like an object in a story that wasn't mine. Then Kell's words sliced through the air. "Maybe another time you'll satisfy us just as well." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was enough to make my knees weak. Another time. There would be no other time. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my heart stuttered against my ribs. This was it. This was the end. Not just of tonight, but of everything. They were leaving, walking out the door with their backs turned to me, as if I had already become a memory. I could feel the cold air they left behind, and the silence that filled the room was more oppressive than anything. I was alone again, but this time I wasn't sure if I felt relief or dread. It was like being dropped back into my own skin, my own life, only now it didn't quite fit. I could still feel them in the air, lingering like smoke. I needed to leave. I needed to run away, to escape the suffocating thoughts swirling around my head. I couldn't be here, not with the weight of what I had done pressing on me, making me feel as though I were suffocating in my own home. It was too much, too raw, too real. I had to escape the house, the neighbors, my husband's inevitable questions. The thought of facing him, of looking him in the eye, made my skin crawl. What could I say? What could I tell him? I had betrayed everything we had built together. And yet, in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to face him. I wanted to believe it was just a mistake, that it was something everyone could do once, a lapse in judgment. Everyone deserved that kind of mistake, didn't they? We all made them. Maybe I was entitled to one too. A fleeting moment of indulgence. But the guilt gnawed at me relentless, tearing at the edges of my thoughts. I had to convince myself it wouldn't happen again. This would be the only time. I had to believe that for my own sake. As the night wore on, the feelings of regret kept rising up, choking me. I wanted to tell myself it was just one of those things, something to bury in the past and never revisit. But I couldn't shake the sensation of being marked. A part of me had been irrevocably changed, and no matter how I tried to push it away, it lingered. I wasn't proud of what I had done, but I also knew that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I wouldn't tell my husband. I couldn't bear the thought of him knowing, of him looking at me with that disappointed gaze. I would carry this secret, hidden deep within me, buried beneath layers of what I had become. It would be the first and last time, and in the quiet ache of my heart, I could only pray that I would never have to face it again. The days that followed were uneventful, almost soothing in their quiet. I moved through them like a ghost, pretending that nothing had happened, convincing myself that the slip-up, the moment of weakness, had been a single fleeting misstep. I clung to the belief that it would never happen again. I had made my decision, and that decision had to stand. I couldn't bear the thought of letting it consume me any longer. So I buried it deep, just as I had done with so many other things in my life. I tried to focus on the ordinary rhythm of my existence. The twins still came over, as they always had, bringing with them the noise and chaos of youth. Their laughter, their bright, eager faces. At first, I had felt a strange twinge of shame when they entered the house, as though they might sense what had happened, but that feeling slowly faded. Weeks passed, and I began to feel that everything was forgotten. It seemed as though life had returned to its regular course. My husband and I went about our days, slipping into the comfort of routines. I told myself it was enough. I had to accept that this was my life now. Even the small getaway we took, a few days away from the world, just the two of us, felt like a return to something familiar. It was peaceful, like stepping into a moment frozen in time. For a while I believed I had done well, that I had moved past the mistake and resumed my life as it was meant to be. But then the quiet began to shift. When we returned from vacation, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The feeling had crept up on me, slowly but insistently, like a whisper in the back of my mind. A hunger. A desire. It was a strange sensation, something I hadn't recognized in so long. I was an old woman, they said, but there was a part of me that had not aged, not truly. And that part was awakening, demanding more. I fought against it. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting thought. I had my life, my home, my family. There was no place for those reckless impulses anymore. But the thoughts would not leave me. They were like a force pushing against my own resistance, nudging me towards something I thought I had outgrown. I began to feel restless, almost agitated, like a part of me was being denied something vital. It was a deep pulsing need. I tried to ignore it, but it was like an energy, an undercurrent I couldn't outrun. And when my husband went off again to one of his club events, something inside me snapped. I didn't even think, not in any rational sense. It was as though I were being pulled by something beyond my control. They arrived at my door just like before. Only this time it was different. I felt it, the unmistakable awareness of my own desire, the longing that had been so carefully buried, now rising to the surface. I found myself standing there, naked, the cool air brushing against my skin, as though I had never left that moment behind. I was on my knees, feeling exposed in a way I hadn't in years. There was no hesitation now, no second thoughts clouding my mind. It wasn't about the act. It wasn't even about them. It was about me, the woman who had been hidden away, buried beneath layers of time and obligation. She had reawakened, and I couldn't deny her anymore. Like this video and subscribe to Nasty Talks. Don't forget to send this video to your friends on WhatsApp, so they can enjoy it too. Thanks for being here with me.